Good afternoon, everybody. You may be wondering why I should be a person who could talk to you about the story of dementia, or indeed write a book about the subject. Well, I'm not a person with dementia. I wasn't a carer when I started out this work. I am currently a carer, and I am a writer. So, in fact, my qualifications, if you can call them that, is that I've worked in the dementia field for 26 years, working with carers, directly with people with dementia, and working in all sorts of dementia settings, people's own homes, in care environments, that's hospitals and care homes and day centres. And my particular interest has always been in communication and creativity. But this book was branching out a bit for me, the story of dementia. As Gavin said, nobody has dared, foolish enough to write the story of dementia. But I have. So fool I may be. And when I set out to write it, I suddenly realized it was a very odd title, because nobody knows the beginning of the story, and nobody knows what the end of the story will be, and we're stuck in the middle. So it's actually a book about the middle tranche of dementia, with a very vague idea of the beginning and no clear vision of the future, though I do make some perhaps rash suggestions. Now, nobody knows how long what we call dementia has existed. But what we do know is that at a certain point in time, a certain person did a certain diagnosis and called it Alzheimer's. And the year was 1906. Now, ever since then, there have been two strands of dementia: how you look at it, how you research it, how you help people. And one strand is called the biomedical. And the person who discovered dementia, if you put it that way, named Alzheimer's, was a worker in the biomedical field. And he started a whole chain of biomedical research and development. And it was some years before anybody started to work in the alternative view of dementia, which is what I represent and what this book represents, because it's a little bit of a bombshell in the dementia world. Because the dementia world has been dominated by the biomedical. That's where the money's gone. That's where most of the research has been done. But there is this alternative view, which I'm going to present to you this afternoon, and which is represented by my book. And we call this the psychosocial view of dementia. Now, in 1906, Alois Alzheimer diagnosed a lady called Frau August D. in Frankfurt. And he did this on the basis of one person. He diagnosed Alzheimer's on the basis of one person, which certainly couldn't happen today, because research has developed to the extent where any generalization we may make about dementia or Alzheimer's or any of the other forms of dementia would require enormous amounts of research, possibly all over the world. So we have one person's diagnosis, and not everybody agrees with that diagnosis. So there is some confusion and some dispute over the beginnings of dementia. Did he explore other options? Why did he go down this one track which had never been explored before? Well, on page 25 of my book, I will give you a little bit of insight. From 1903 to 1912, his years in Munich, Alzheimer's became a well-loved figure to students from all over the world. He would spend hours with each one, explaining things as they shared a microscope, always with a cigar that would be put down as he commenced his explanations. And it is said that at the end of the day, there would always be a cigar stump at every student's bench by the microscope. So that characterizes him a little bit. The term might never have come into general circulation if the steady increase in life expectancy had not had repercussions on mental health. Yet even in 1970, that's a long way on from 1906, Brendan Maher, in his book Principles of Psychopathology, stated, Alzheimer's disease is statistically infrequent and of little interest to students of psychopathology. But by 1983, it was impossible to ignore the effects of demographic change. So in Australia, Scott Henderson could publish an article entitled The Coming Epidemic of Dementia, whilst in 1989 in Britain, Robert Woods was authoring a book called Alzheimer's Disease, Coping with a Living Death. Today it is impossible to escape the name of the man who bears the condition's name. It is on everyone's lips. Many have little idea of its origin or meaning, but one thing we can be sure of, it has the capacity to instill dread. The psychologist Tom Kitwood, whom we're going to talk about in a minute, states, the whole conceptual framework of biomedical research into dementia is far from adequate to the problem field. It is necessary to have a paradigm in order to focus attention on particular problems. This paradigm, however, does not provide a sound basis for the general explanation of dementia, Alzheimer's or any other type. It is logically flawed and does not easily accommodate the full range of evidence. So that's the alternative view to the medical view, that's the full explanation. And of course the medical view has immediately gone forward to look for a cure. It's never been found. And though there's been much research and a lot of money spent and a lot of work done in universities, nobody, and of course through drugs companies, nobody has yet found a cure. And I believe that the researchers have now adopted a new tack because they don't want to give up. They've got livelihoods. And the new tack is to say, well, dementia has multiple causes. And so that gives us the opportunity to do multiple research. So in fact, their research base has expanded to accommodate the failure of the first attempts. Now, Kitwood is the man who wrote that, and Tom Kitwood is probably the man, there's a chapter on him in my book, who has most to do with the development of the psychosocial approach. He was professor of psychology at Bradford University, and he only published one book, and it's called Dementia Reconsidered, The Person Comes First. And that was published in 1997. It's a modest book, 150 pages, but my goodness, it contained a great deal. And if there's one book you should read about dementia, apart from mine, of course, it's Tom Kitwood's book, because it contains the kernel of almost everything in the psychosocial side that has been researched since. He attacks determinism, the idea that dementia is a disease and therefore has to be wholly researched as if it was a cancer. And he objects to that, and I'll read you a quote from him in a minute. a list of things which he feels that approach leaves out. Some of the things that he said ought to be considered in talking about dementia, apart from the biomedical, are culture, locality, social class, education, financial resources, the availability or absence of support and services. Also, at the interpersonal or social psychological level, much depends on how far a person with dementia is enabled to retain intact relationships, to use his or her abilities, or to experience variety and enjoyment. Well, there's a whole package there, and some of the other chapters in my book, perhaps probably all of them, apart from my own at the end, which is speculative, are in fact explorations of some of those aspects from that list. He also spoke of what he called malignant social psychology. He said that the way we treat people with dementia, the way we look at them as a society and as individuals, the way we behave towards them, can actually exacerbate the dementia. Now, that is a very, very hard message for people who are caring for people with dementia, and both as professional staff and as family carers, to take on board. That in fact you could be pursuing a malignant social psychology, almost certainly through ignorance, because we don't know a lot, but we do know some things, and we may be doing those wrong. In fact, in his list of examples of malignant social psychology, he lists 17 different ways in which we actually can make things worse for the person with dementia. Of course, there are many ways in which we can make things better, and we'll be going on to some of those. Another thing he attacked was institutionalization. People put into care homes and hospital wards, places where they're locked up together, which was a worse situation when he wrote than it is now, but it's still very prevalent that people are isolated in units and so on. And he developed a way of assessing what the kind of care was like in these places. And this is called dementia care mapping. And this is done by 2 members of staff or researchers observing in units and with tick lists, very elaborate tick lists, deciding whether in fact the care in that particular establishment is positive or malignant. He talked about another innovative approach. It's just full, this book, of his book of innovative approaches. Another innovative approach which Tom proposes, and which has had far-reaching effects, is that instead of generalizing about people with dementia and how they might feel about their condition and the care offered to them, it might be possible to consult them and to act upon their views. In 1997, this was still quite a revolutionary suggestion. Now, though in some quarters it still has an air of novelty, generally it is accepted that this is a workable idea, and with some organizations run by people with the condition, it has resulted in the mantra, "Nothing for us without us." It's a powerful message. Nothing for us without us. Consultation, taking us into your consideration and asking us what you feel and how we might help you. Now, obviously I can't cover the whole of this book in about 40 minutes, but I am going to then move on to that particular issue, which is so important. And one of the chapters I called Kitwood the Visionary, And this chapter is called The Experiences. These are the people who actually are living with dementia and speaking and writing about it. Incidentally, in Scotland here, we have a remarkable example of a pressure group of people with dementia called the Scottish Dementia Working Group, which is part funded by Alzheimer's Scotland, but is also very independent. Now, there's a book by someone with dementia just been published in Britain, and the publishers claim it's the first autobiographical book. I'm sorry, it ain't. I've got 15 on my shelves. And the first one was by a clergyman in America. But the two most interesting writers, to my mind, who have dementia and who have written books are Christine Bryden. She's Australian, and Kate Swaffer, and she's Australian. Why Australia should be the place where people have spoken out most clearly, I have no idea. Christine Bryden's first book was called Who Will I Be When I Die? And this was published in 1998. And her second book was called Dancing with Dementia, and that was published in 2006. Both of them have been revised by her and expanded and republished, and they're both published as is the book by Kate Swaffer by Jessica Kingsley, who has published an enormous number of very positive books about dementia, a British publisher. But an Australian writer we're talking about here. The interesting thing about these two writers, Bryden and Swaffer, incidentally, Swaffer's book is called What the Hell Has Happened to My Brain? With a subtitle, Living Beyond Dementia. And that possibly will lead to a theme in my summing up. Living beyond dementia. Think what that might mean. The similarities between these two writers, they didn't know each other, is extraordinary. Pre-diagnosis, both were high achievers in terms of education and employment, and both developed dementia in their 40s and reflect the inadequate provision for younger people. I haven't said anything about dementia and aging, but I'll perhaps come back to that. Both have obtained academic qualifications since diagnosis. Both have enjoyed the support of exceptional husbands. Both have been active in the political sphere. Both are highly literate and able to organize material. Both have experienced slow developing dementias, which has enabled them to make an impact over a prolonged period. And as a corollary to this latter fact, both have experienced skepticism on the part of people without the condition as to whether they have dementia or not. When this book was first published last year, a professor rang me up and said, "Why have you put Christine Bryden in this book? She's not got dementia." Well, all I can say is that of all the books, of all the people with dementia who have written, to me, she shows the most insight into the condition. So if she hasn't got it, she's a genius. My comments on this, I will read you. What is incontrovertible is that Christine and Kate are completely untypical of the population they claim to represent. We are dealing here with two out of the us who could be involved in decision making. That's currently, with people with the diagnosis, over 47 million worldwide. I do not wish to suggest that many of the topics they cover and the insights they provide are not profoundly relevant and valuable, but I do believe that the history of dementia is one of people with the condition being grievously left behind. We urgently need to widen the consultation base, publish far more writings and interviews, include far more people with dementia on decision-making bodies, and get them involved in research projects. I don't see much sign of that happening yet. We've an awful long way to go in so many areas. This is all part of finding out what this mysterious condition is. Now, I said I'd say something about aging. When I started out, the experts, put those in inverted commas, I won't name any, the experts said that dementia was not a condition of aging. But now they've changed their tune. They've had to, because so many people over the age of 65, and as they get nearer 100, develop dementia. The statistics will show that clearly. Aging is a very important factor in developing the condition. And since we have societies which are aging fast, there's no way we're going to escape not having to deal with any of the problems in the future. I'm moving on to a man called Peter Whitehouse. Now, he's written a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's. It's a profoundly challenging book. Its subtitle is What You Aren't Being Told About Today's Most Dreaded Diagnosis. Now, what's fascinating about Peter, he's an American, is that he started out in the biomedical sphere as a researcher, trying to find a cure. And he did a big career switch after about 20 years of this, decided not only was it the wrong thing to be doing, but that it was the wrong approach altogether to dementia. And he moved right across onto the psychosocial side. He's the only person I know who has written a book which illustrates that. He says here why he wrote the book. It was published, incidentally, in 2008. To empower readers to stand up to the dominant, stigmatizing biological myth of Alzheimer's that scientists like myself, with more than a little help from the drugs companies and others with personal and financial interests, have unleashed on individual lives, and to reframe the way we know and experience our aging selves. So he sees it as a pioneering book. Now, I've called Peter the unifier because he unifies the biological side and the psychosocial side. And I've written, of course, he's also the iconoclast, the dismantler of the dominance of the medical model, and single-handedly has mounted a distinctive attack on the largely barren field of biological research, and is the upholder of a broader, more humane vision of how we might approach the subject. He has capitalized on the Kitwood legacy, incorporating the advances made by those featured in the other chapters in my book, and others who have made a contribution, because obviously I couldn't cover everybody. He has drawn together the psychosocial threads to make a coherent garment for us all to wear. In other words, when we do reach a final decision about what this thing is that we are dealing with, this immense, puzzling, threatening, but also positive in some ways thing that we're dealing with, then we need the psychosocial and we need the biological. And there'll have to be some way of reconciling them. when I gave a talk in the Edinburgh International Book Festival last year, I was reading from this book, and my partner in crime was reading from her book, which was entirely biological. The word Kitwood, the name Kitwood, which is the key name in my book and in many others on this side of the divide, doesn't appear once in her book. It's all about people doing biological research. So it was somebody came up to me the other day who'd been there and said, how interesting. I felt there was a real conflict smouldering beneath the surface. There was. My last chapter is called Has Dementia a Future? And I posed myself that question deliberately because I thought I'd find an interesting answer. I didn't know what I was going to say. And this is how it ends. I cannot claim to have other than glimmerings of where the dementia story may take us next. What I am certain of, though, is that the one presented to us by the self-styled gurus, to no names here, and they receive no mentions in this book, the organisations set up to promote care and research, and the media which present watered down or distorted versions of this story, is seriously inadequate. To adopt a literary metaphor, we are offered a sketch when what we are dealing with is a book of the proportions and intricacy of a novel. So, my personal answer to the question posed at the outset, has dementia a future, is no. I do not think dementia as at present conceived or misconceived has a future. Something as little understood, as fumblingly diagnosed, as inhumanely treated, does not deserve a future. For we will be stuck with it if we don't do something about ourselves. And this is widening the debate beyond the biomedical and even the psychosocial. Our economic, our political, and our social institutions, in short, our whole way of life. We have the dementia we deserve. Maybe we have created it out of a combination of ignorance and greed, out of following the wrong star. If we can change course in time and concentrate on creating compassionate, integrated societies, we could see it wither on the vine. I am living in hope that this is a story that will have a happy ending.